So we have a new Halloween film coming out, the 11th one I think, but one that will ignore every film aside from the original movie. I wanted to take a look back at the franchise that I've had a lot of fun with and does mean quite a lot to me. Starting with the first, the original Halloween movie is a masterpiece. It was really the first film that got me into horror movies in general. When I was a kid, my mum and older sibling would often sit and watch horror movies together, and I'd have no choice but to sit in the living room with them, trying my best to avoid pissing my pants. It was either that or run upstairs where I'd be on my own, and as we all know from watching horror movies, going off on your own is often the first and last mistake you'll ever make. As a result of childhood traumas like watching bits and pieces of The Exorcist at the age of 6, I pretty much stayed away from horror movies. I think I just kind of assumed I hated them because of, well, I don't know really. In part, I guess, because of being scared shitless of them when I was young, but even when I grew up and my love for film began to develop, I didn't really have an interest in horror. I loved monster movies, yeah. Films like Aliens, Predator and The Thing were some of my favorites from my childhood years, but when I was a kid, I never really thought of them as horror films. They were more sci-fi for me, and I was always fascinated by the idea of what was out there anyway. As a kid, horror for me meant things like ghouls, ghosts, poltergeists, and things that go bump in the night, that sort of stuff. Strangely, the blood and guts of xenomorphs ripping people apart and predators tearing spines from bodies never really fazed me, and ironically I seem to be the only person in the household not sickened by monsters bursting through your chest, or even the ugliness and ferociousness of, say, something like the orcs in Fellowship of the Ring, despite that being a family film. But the minute you mentioned horror, I would switch off. I didn't want to know. This is why Halloween is so special. You always remember your first time, as they say. And I remember flicking through films on my phone, looking on IMDb for something to watch. On that site, you could click on High Noon and end up on Posh Spice's profile page in just a few clicks. And I was looking at The Thing, a great film, and the filmography of the guy who made it, John Carpenter. Halloween was arguably his most famous movie. I'd heard of it obviously, but never made even an ounce of an attempt to see it. But I did, after a couple of days. I guess a voice in my head just said, give it a go, try something different. And when I sat down and watched Halloween, this guy who intentionally stayed away from horror for his entire life really, I was blown away at how much I enjoyed it. I had a very lucky experience watching Halloween, in that as someone who stayed away from horror movies, I hadn't become sanitized or bored by the cliches of the slasher subgenre, many of which originated from or were popularized by Halloween. I recognize a lot of trademarks, like the baddie who you think is dead, sitting up behind the protagonist who's looking the other way, but I never at all felt like I was watching anything stale. It all felt so fresh, so inventive, like the shot of Michael Myers' white, ghostly face appearing against the blackness in one particularly chilling scene, and another where a guy is wandering around a house, and you know Michael is there, you know a jump scare is coming, you just don't know when, and then it hits. And it really got me. I'm not saying I was a complete novice to slashers, but as someone who watched Halloween for the first time in, say, I think about 2010, I do wonder if I would have enjoyed it as much if I had become accustomed to its imitators. And to be honest, I think I would have. Halloween isn't just one of the founding fathers of the slasher genre. It's genuinely a well-made movie in its own right. The creative touches in the film are genius. Its ability to pull you in and keep you tense and enthralled is an ability that does not exist in most movies of its kind. It's quite simply the touch of John Carpenter. Halloween would spur me on to go on and complete Carpenter's directorial filmography, and he became one of my favourite directors. There's something about his films, most of his films, a certain vibe, a certain feeling that, when present, allows me to enjoy a film greatly. I can't really explain what it is, but his hits like Big Trouble in Little China, Escape from New York, They Live, and Christine all had it, and even some of his films that were and still are panned, like Ghost of Mars, had it. I really enjoyed that movie, and I'm not ashamed to admit it. It was cheesy, it was goofy, but it had the Carpenter touch. Escape from LA is another one as well. Other films of his, like The Ward and his Village of the Damned remake, lacked that special something that most of his films had. They didn't feel like John Carpenter movies, and as a result, I didn't take to them. But anyway, going back to Halloween, and it's like the movie knows how good it is. Even the ballsy way it starts, with Carpenter's now legendary score and the zooming in of that pumpkin, it's like the film is betting on itself, like it's saying, strap in ladies and gentlemen. And what I found most surprising was how much I enjoyed the film. What I mean is, I had fun watching it. I wasn't scared out of my wits, stressed to no end, or hoping it would end as soon as possible, as sometimes I do now even with horror movies, with horror movies that I think are good. I was chilling. I was relaxed. It was a movie about innocent people being murdered that I was enjoying. Speaking of which, the characters in the film were great. Laurie Strode, of course, but also the wonderful Dr. Loomis, who I consider as the heart and soul of the Halloween franchise. From the characters, I mean. And the movie was just so full of many surprises. Throughout, it was so inventive, so cool. That's the thing about Carpenter films. They're just cool, aren't they? The synth soundtrack, combined with one of the horror genre's favourite musical instruments, the piano. The opening killing with the shocking revelation that it was done by a child, the escape, the numerous creative kills, the camera angles, the brilliant use of shadow. The movie was made for less than $1 million, but somehow Carpenter made it look so polished, so professional, but at the same time there was a rawness to it. And let's not forget the ending, which elevated the entire film. I was ready to slap this film with a badge of approval, but then when Loomis looks down to the spot where Michael falls after being shot, and he isn't there, and that killer music starts playing, it just takes the film to a whole new level. What a way to end it. You've practically changed the genre. We're now looking at something supernatural now. This psychiatrist who was telling everyone that Michael Myers is pure evil, clearly now we see he didn't just mean he was a bad person. He was actually evil personified. How did he get up? Is he some kind of phantom? So many questions, but the only thing we're told is that he's out there still. And what sells it, what really sells it, is the look that Loomis gives, which was a suggestion from Donald Pleasence himself. Instead of the, oh my, he's nowhere to be found expression, Loomis gives this look that just says, yep, I knew this was going to happen. We're intruding now on this personal moment between him and Michael Myers, secret knowledge of the shape that only Loomis, through his years of work and experience, knew. The nightmare isn't over. It might have only just begun. It was such a great film, and really opened the floodgates for me. Before I continued watching the Halloween series, I started to watch more horror movies because of Halloween, and in doing so I discovered new subgenres and new filmmakers. I remember my experience with Halloween spurred me to try films like A Nightmare on Elm Street and Friday the 13th. The Elm Street series I completed, and there were some solid entries like Part 3, New Nightmare, the original of course, and Freddy vs. Jason. The Friday movies, not so much. I feel they lacked a signature style and came off quite bland. I couldn't get past the second one. But anyway, now that I had popped my cherry with these kind of films, I was trying out all sorts. Phantasm was one, Candyman another. I watched a weird dreamlike movie on TV called Inferno, which I loved, and which caused me to discover Dario Argento, and in turn one of my favourites now, Mario Bava, director of films like Bay of Blood and Black Lace. And I'm still making new discoveries in horror. As a film fan, part of the pleasure is obviously from the films themselves, but a lot of it also comes from the sense of discovery when you find new films, new directors, new genres. And with horror, for me, it all started with Halloween. The success of Halloween, something like $70 million made off a $300,000 budget, pretty much guaranteed a sequel. Carpenter didn't want to do it, and I wasn't sure I wanted to see a sequel either, since the ending of the first film was perfect as it was. Why do we need another one? But they were going to make it with or without Carpenter, so he went ahead and wrote a sequel, and gave directing duties to Rick Rosenthal, whilst also providing the music again. Apparently, Carpenter had to drink heavily to produce a script, so in other words, he was literally drunk when writing Halloween 2. The second film I have mixed feelings on. For the most part, I could do without its existence, as it tampers with the open-endedness of the original's climax. Even the way it starts is so weird. It was clearly established in the ending of the first movie that Loomis wasn't at all shocked to see that Michael had disappeared. But Halloween 2, which begins immediately after the first, in fact it actually covers a lot of the same ground at the end, the film has him run downstairs and he stays in horror at the comical body-shaped dent in the front lawn. Like, why is he shocked? At the end of the first film, he made that face that I love so much, that expression that said or suggested that he knew something like this was going to happen. And now he's all, oh, he got up, oh dear. But even saying that, the opening is actually one of my favourite parts of the entire franchise. Probably not for the reasons intended by the filmmakers, but it absolutely cracked me up. The way the poor neighbour, who's been trick-or-treated all night, comes out to see what all the hullabaloo is about, and Loomis just looks at him with a killer deadpan stare, and he's just like, bitch, please, go back inside and tuck yourself in, because you don't know what death is. And then suddenly Carpenter's music comes on, a much funkier and groovier one than the originals, like a disco remix, and Loomis goes running off like he's trying to work out where the music's coming from. Then we fade and the credits start to roll, with us being treated to a different but equally cool version of Carpenter's Halloween score. The opening still makes me laugh today. It's a mixture of genuine coolness, but also hilarious funkiness. You could only make an opening like that in the 80s. There's a couple of other standout moments too. One part where Loomis and a cop chase down Michael, who crashes into a car and disintegrates in a fiery explosion, with the cop screaming at Loomis to confirm his identity. Later on, in a scene which I believe was shot by Carpenter himself doing reshoots, or so I've heard, a kid with a stereo bumps into the real Michael, and we have confirmation that it wasn't even him who burned in the car. The camera follows him walking down the street, again with that catchy theme. It's weird, isn't it, how relatively insignificant scenes can often be the ones we end up remembering the most from films. Saying that though, that's pretty much where my praise for Halloween 2 ends. I did not like this film very much. It started off strongly with the hunt for Michael in the night being the focus, but once we switched to the hospital setting for the film, it slowed down a lot and got quite boring. You would think a hospital at night would be the perfect setting for a Halloween movie, and maybe it is, but the film is a massive step down from the first film. The reliance on gore and schlock and shock makes it a bit interchangeable with the common average slasher flicks that were coming out in drones at the time, and the film just lacks the original's craft and understanding of horror, instead going for gross out effects. Michael Myers, being played in this one by Dick Warlock, looked very awkward walking around the abandoned hospital corridors, and dare I say it, kind of funny. I know it's not a popular opinion, but there you go. Halloween 2 is also the movie that birthed the Laurie is Michael's sister angle again, showing a complete misunderstanding of the original movie, whose terror is heightened by us not knowing why Michael is doing his killings. I always hated the sister thing, and it's one of the reasons this film left a bad taste in my mouth. It's definitely not the worst the franchise has to offer, and when you see sequels piling up with diminishing quality, it does make you appreciate the earlier films a little more, but this film didn't do it for me, and I was glad that Carpenter killed off Michael. Which brings us to Halloween 3, Season of the Witch. Oh boy, everyone's got an opinion on this one, haven't they? Here's a film I felt really sorry for. As most of us know now, as if sensing the crumbling horror world of hundreds of sequels where baddies chase half-naked teenagers around and stab them to death, Carpenter wanted to do an anthology-style Halloween universe where a completely unrelated horror film would be released every Halloween under the Halloween title, with the festival being the only thing that connects the films. One, maybe about aliens, the other about ghosts, vampires, werewolves, or whatever. He got his chance with this entry after having killed off Michael Myers, and when it came out, Michael had become such a staple of the Halloween franchise. Obviously, an audience were furious that the film had nothing to do with Michael Myers or the events of the first two movies, and they, in all honesty, they probably felt cheated. Who's to say who's to blame? Should the producers have realized that when marketing a movie called Halloween, audiences would come expecting to see Myers make a return? Should the film fans have realized that the ending of the last movie clearly meant Michael wasn't coming back? Who knows, it's too late for this debate. It's just a shame really, because I really liked Halloween 3. I knew Michael wasn't in it going in, and knew of its horrid reputation, so this obviously had an effect on me adjusting my expectations, but I liked it. I mean, I really liked it. Who knows how different the fate of the Halloween franchise could have turned out if they just named the movie Season of the Witch and took out the Halloween name. This one had a brilliant tone, an eerie, sinister, creepy feel of a world where everything around you is being manufactured to work against you. There's that sci-fi man versus the dodgy, faceless, powerful corporation feel, and it's really grim. I remember being really impressed with the opening credits and the first scene of the film. No words necessary, just Carpenter's music and a man running from a car in the dead of the night. Carpenter and Alan Howarth really did well here. They chose not to simply remix the original Halloween theme, but to go for something completely different. The music perfectly sets the ominous tone for the film, and the opening scene's soundtrack, which I think might be the original Halloween theme played backwards, which I've heard, is really cool, and one of the best synth soundtracks of the 80s, I think. Throughout the entire film, the movie's music provides the fuel for the chills. Part of it always reminded me of the score for Terminator 1. The film has the 80s B-movie conspiracy vibe, the claustrophobic small-town atmosphere, a likeable lead with a solid moustache. It's genuinely creepy, has the balls to kill off entire families, including and especially children, with the ending being one of the best shots of the entire franchise. And there also being another really great one of the children going trick-or-treating. Dean Cundley shot the film, so it retains that brilliant lighting shot composition of films like, the original, The Fog and The Thing. It's a spooky film, and I really do wish they went ahead with the anthology idea. The failure of Season of the Witch and his idea for a fourth film, which involved the effects of Michael Myers' killing being explored on the town, prompted John Carpenter along with co-producer Deborah Hill to leave the Halloween franchise. And as such, I think from the fourth one, it pretty much lost its identity. At the very least, the Halloween movies onwards would feel very different and very much embrace that they were now full-on slasher flicks. There's two things I remember really liking about Halloween 4, The Return of Michael Myers. The first thing is the opening credits, which perfectly captured that autumn creepiness of the approaching Halloween, and the ending, which was new and surprising, having Michael's niece suddenly kill someone after his apparent death, suggesting that this might be some kind of family curse. It's an ending that would go on to be wasted in the next film, Halloween 5. We just kind of had her in the hospital recovering, essentially retconning the ending to go back to the template of Michael Myers going around stabbing people. Halloween 4, 5 and 6 were pretty much interchangeable, bar a few significant scenes. There was an inherent weakness in the decision to bring back not only Myers but Loomis too, with a few bumps and scratches. I was actually flabbergasted at producers' audacity to make that decision. And then also these movies just became typical slashers. Myers also became a lumbering oaf like Jason Voorhees, with someone clearly forgetting that in the original he was quite the sneaky bastard, and he'd often go out of the way to troll and scare the shite out of his victims. And that's pretty much what Halloween 4 to 6 were, Michael Myers chasing women around with a knife, in a mask that often was drastically different in quality from film to film. Or when Loomis would hobble around barking in little children's faces as if they weren't traumatized enough. I think the fifth film is the worst offender of the three, mainly because it's the one that doesn't really offer anything new. 4 had the ending, 6 had, for better or worse, the whole thing with the Thorn cult, but 5 didn't really do anything new. And the ending, where there's this dude dressed in black who presumably has something to do with Michael being released from prison, I mean, it was all getting a bit boring now, and it was evident they were running out of ideas. The Thorn cult was a much hated thing, but by this time, Michael Myers was already ruined, and I found it interesting, if not bemusingly weird. It was also strange how we went from a guy stabbing teenagers to, weird supernatural cults. I credit Halloween 6 with also being a lot more brutal than its predecessor, with an especially disturbing relation that the young girl, Laurie's niece I think, can't remember her name, goes through the traumatic experience of being hunted by Myers in part 4, becoming a psycho killer herself, later getting kidnapped by the cult, imprisoned for years, raped by her uncle, having a baby and having it forcibly taken away from her, managing to escape and send a message to Dr. Loomis for help, only to be killed off. What a sad life. Anyway, Halloween 6 was the end of the original timeline really. Later original star Jamie Lee Curtis was part of a anniversary movie. I think she was the one who wanted to do it in the first place. So we got Halloween H20, which pretty much ignored everything after the second movie. It was possible that we might have had John Carpenter direct too, but the producers turned down his huge paycheck demands. I think it was 10 million, an amount he thought was fair given how much he missed out on from the original. When you watch Halloween H20, it feels a little cynical because it feels like a movie clearly made in the wake of Scream and trying to capitalize on the success of it and the revival of the slasher movie in the 90s. The look and feel of the movie is similar. There are a lot of jump scare fake outs. It even has uncredited music work from Scream's composer, a complete detachment from the sounds we're used to hearing from Halloween movies. Loomis isn't in it, as Pleasance had died, which is a bummer. Michael Myers' mask looked really weird too. I mean, how hard is it to get the mask right? And in one scene it was actually CGI. What the hell? I don't like it when a new film comes along and decides to kick previous films out of canon. I especially don't like it when a new film comes along and decides to kick previous films out of canon and ends up being almost as shit as the films it kicked out in the first place. H20 sounds cool. Jamie Lee Curtis, the original Scream Queen, is back. Michael Myers hunts her down 20 years later. But the execution is lousy. To be fair, I really enjoyed the first half, which focused on Laurie's trauma and her overprotective nature of her son because of her past experiences. That lack of closure in the air, the knowledge that he's still out there somewhere, is really uncomfortable. Focusing on the post-traumatic stress and how Laurie adjusts to normal life after that insane experience was well handled and made for interesting viewing. There's a promise of something new, something different, but when Michael actually shows up, it becomes quite boring. The movie feels quite OTT as well. The music, the facial expressions, everything so over the top, like in Scream, but without the wit and self-awareness that made that franchise so special. But at least it gave Laurie closure, ending with her killing Michael at the end once and for all. Done, dusted, the end of the Halloween franchise. It may have been a rocky ride, but at least it had a conclusion. But not for long, of course, because this movie was followed up with what is often considered the worst film of the entire Halloween franchise, barring the remake series, Halloween Resurrection. It undoes the last film's conclusion in ridiculous fashion, and then to add insult to injury, you think the movie is going to be about Michael chasing Laurie around again for the entire runtime, but he ends up taking her out in about the first 10 minutes or so, and that's it. She's dead in the first 10 minutes of the movie. It's absolutely infuriating, and what follows is even worse. The movie fully embraces the MTV pop star culture that the 90s slasher flicks started to be linked with, by having it follow a group of guys, gals and TV crew who stay in the house that Michael's first killings took place. And bizarrely, Michael, now that he's achieved his goal, just kind of hangs around the house, and new intruders give him a chance to retest his blade. It's ridiculous. There's no story. It's literally just these people creeping around the house. And what was the point in making it a Halloween film? You know, you could have had any film about a bunch of people going around a house that's got a serial killer inside. It's just so bad. There's no atmosphere, no memorable characters, nothing. And I distinctly remember Myers getting kung fu kicked at one point also. And then for several years it all went quiet on the Halloween front, until cult horror filmmaker Rob Zombie decided to remake Carpenter's original in 2007. Like probably every film in the franchise bar the 1978 picture, a completely pointless endeavour and one that many fans hated. I do think though, and don't get me wrong, I didn't like the film either, but people tend to lump this film in with the far worse Halloween 2, which Zombie would make a couple of years later. One of the most hated aspects of the Halloween remake is the fact that they decided to give Michael a proper backstory, having him being a neglected, abused child who went into an institution and began to withdraw into himself and these masks that he drew and made. Giving a prequel story to The Shape angered many people, but funnily enough, I didn't mind it. It was actually my favourite thing about the film. It isn't part of the original canon, so it's not as if they can ruin the original Michael Myers. This is just Zombie's take on the character, his interpretation. And all of the stuff with Michael's youth and when he's in the can was actually stuff I was digging. It's when he becomes the shape and the film just starts to cheaply recreate the beats from the original without the delicate craft when it became quite dull and unmemorable. I don't remember much of Halloween 2, but I do remember thinking it was one of the worst experiences of my life. It was like they tried to make a film as bad as they could, like they were actively challenging Resurrection for the title of Worst Halloween Movie. I remember finding it quite funny how Michael, the silent assassin, grunts and moans as he stabs people to death. That's not Michael Myers. The main actress was horrid as well, her cringy screeching and crying being the scariest thing about the film. And there was some Michael Myers dream sequences involving his mum and a horse, a donkey or something. Don't really remember. I don't know. It was just bloody bollocks all around. And so here we are, 40 years after John Carpenter's original scared the shite out of audiences. The new Halloween sequel called, Halloween, brings back Jamie Lee Curtis again, and again it decides what is canon and what is not, by deciding to ignore every Halloween film except the first this time, even H20 and Halloween 2. So thankfully, Laurie is not Michael's sister. The interpretation of Curtis's Laurie is a lot different here than in H20, judging by the trailers and the reaction from the film. Halloween 2018 seems to have jumped on the bandwagon of modern-day girl power fever by making her grizzled old Laurie, part damaged and part ready, prepared for Michael's and hers destined reunion. She set traps Home Alone style, and he escapes and comes after her. Nothing complicated, simple premise. A reboot, if anything. I haven't seen it yet. It's getting rave reviews though. Carpenter did the score, so I'm looking forward to it. If I don't like it, I doubt it'll be the worst Halloween experience I've had. If it's good, well then great. The director and producers at least seem to really want it to work. I hear they've already planned sequels, which is worrying really, I think. I mean, even if the original film is good. I guess in a way we're going to go back in time. A good first movie that will no doubt be followed up with mediocre sequels. Still though, the Halloween franchise is an interesting one. I definitely had fun with it. With long-running franchises, to be a true fan, I think you have to see all the movies, even the bad ones. The poorer films, like the meme-generating Star Wars prequels or the numerous bizarre sequels to the Alien and Predator movies, the pain of seeing the crap films is part of the experience, part of what makes you appreciate the better films in the series and the franchise as a whole. I have as much fun discussing the terrible Halloween 6 as I do the classic original. No film in the series is exactly the same, and yeah, it was a worthy movie experience. I hope I haven't bored you to death with this really long discussion. If these franchise discussions are something you want to see more of, then let me know. And I would also like to hear your views on the Halloween films. Let me know in the comments below, and thanks for watching.